Let's get started. Story number 1.
I had never been much for the desert. Give me the mountains, the forests, the oceans, but the desert always made me uneasy. Still, when my friend Marcus suggested a road trip through the Southwest, camping along the way, I figured I could push past it. We were both teachers, fresh into summer break, and the idea of open skies and endless landscapes sounded like the perfect way to shake off the year's stress. Plus, Marcus was practically raised in New Mexico. He knew the desert better than anyone I trusted. Our plan was loose. Drive, camp, explore. We weren't aiming for the big parks, no Grand Canyon, no Zion. We were interested in the forgotten places, the tiny dots on the map that most people sped past without a second thought. Places where the land stretched out forever and the sky pressed down heavy and close. By the fourth day, we were deep into Arizona, off the main highways and crawling down narrow roads that looked barely maintained. Marcus was at the wheel, humming along with some old rock station we picked up on the radio, while I kept half an eye on the GPS, which was becoming increasingly unreliable. We decided to find a place called Gallows Wash, a dry riverbed locals talked about in ghost stories and campfire tales. According to Marcus, it was supposed to be the most isolated spot we could find. Perfect for a night under the stars. We got there in the late afternoon, just as the heat was starting to bleed out of the air. The wash was an ugly scar cutting through an otherwise flat expanse of sun-baked earth. Scraggly mesquite trees leaned out over the edges, and the ground was littered with rocks the color of old bones. The place felt wrong the moment I stepped out of the car. Marcus didn't seem to notice. He was already hauling gear out of the trunk, setting up our little two-person tent, a few feet from a pile of ancient stones that looked like the remains of some forgotten structure. I stood there a moment longer, staring out across the wash, feeling the way the land seemed to hum with a low, unpleasant energy. It wasn't the sound of insects or birds, there weren't any. It was deeper than that, a vibration you felt more than heard, settling into your bones like a bad memory. "You coming, man?" Marcus called. I shook off the feeling and helped him set up camp. As the sun dipped lower, the shadows stretched out like fingers, clawing across the earth. We made a small fire using wood Marcus had brought, since nothing out here seemed alive enough to burn. Dinner was canned beans and cheap beer, and we sat around the fire telling dumb stories, laughing too loud in the suffocating silence. But when the stars came out, everything changed. It wasn't like the kind of night you get in the city, where the lights drown out the sky. Out here, the stars were brutal, sharp, overwhelming. The blackness between them felt heavier than the light they gave off, as if the darkness was something alive, pressing down on us. I found myself staring up too long, feeling dizzy, unmoored, like I could fall upward and be swallowed whole. Marcus didn't notice, or maybe he did, and just didn't want to admit it. He kept the mood light, tossing more wood on the fire, cracking jokes. But there was an edge to him now. He didn't look me in the eye as much. His laughter sounded forced. Around midnight, we decided to call it. The fire was dying, and the cold of the desert night was settling in hard. We climbed into the tent and zipped ourselves in, laying on our sleeping bags, staring up at the thin nylon ceiling. I drifted in and out of sleep, the uneven ground and the creeping cold making it impossible to get comfortable. At some point, I woke up needing to piss. I lay there a minute, listening to the desert outside. The wind had picked up, sighing through the scrub and stones in a way that almost sounded like whispers. I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could and stepped out into the night. The fire was a pile of glowing embers, barely giving off any light. I stumbled a few feet away, did my business, and turned back toward the tent. That's when I saw it. Something was standing at the edge of the wash, about 20 feet away. Tall, impossibly thin, almost blending into the darkness. I thought at first it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the dying fire. But then it moved, a slow, deliberate shifting, like it was turning to face me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The thing stood there, watching. I couldn't make out its face, if it even had one, but I could feel its attention like a weight pressing down on my chest. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't work. Then, just as suddenly, it was gone. One blink, and the space where it stood was empty, just scrub and rock and shadow. I stumbled back into the tent, heart hammering so loud I thought it might wake Marcus. I didn't sleep the rest of the night, just lay there, staring wide-eyed into the dark, listening for any sound, any sign that the thing was still out there. Morning came slow and gray. The sun was hidden behind a thick layer of clouds, and the air felt strangely heavy, like a storm was coming, even though it was the dry season. I packed up our gear in record time, not even waiting for Marcus to finish his coffee. I just wanted to get the hell out of there. Marcus didn't argue. He moved quickly, glancing over his shoulder more than once. Maybe he had seen something too, or maybe he just felt the same wrongness I did. Either way, we didn't talk much as we loaded the car and pulled back onto the cracked road leading away from Gallows Wash. About 5 miles down the road, the car started acting up. The engine sputtered, the dashboard lights flickered, and then it just died. We rolled to a stop on the shoulder, surrounded by nothing but endless desert. Marcus popped the hood and started fiddling with the engine while I stood watch, feeling exposed under the glaring cloud-muted sky. The humming was back, louder now. It seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I glanced around, heart pounding, half expecting to see that thin, awful figure again. Instead, I saw something worse. Off in the distance, near a cluster of low rocks, something was crawling toward us. It was human-shaped, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, bending at angles that made my stomach twist. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and stretched tight over a skeletal frame. It moved with a jerky, spasmodic rhythm, like a puppet yanked on invisible strings. I opened my mouth to scream, but nothing came out. I grabbed Marcus, yanking him back toward the car. "Forget it! We have to go!" I shouted. He didn't argue. We slammed the doors and locked them, sitting there in the dead car, staring as the thing crept closer. It stopped about 50 feet away and just watched. Its head tilted to the side in a grotesque bird-like motion, and I could swear it was smiling. A wide, gaping grin that split its face almost in half. The air inside the car grew colder, our breaths misting in front of our faces. I closed my eyes, clutching the keys in my hand, praying for the car to start. I turned the ignition out of sheer desperation. The engine roared to life. Marcus didn't hesitate. He threw the car into drive, tires spinning on the loose gravel before catching and launching us forward. I risked one last glance in the rearview mirror. The thing was still standing there, watching us leave, its grotesque grin wide and triumphant. We didn't stop again until we reached a tiny town an hour away. We pulled into a gas station and sat there for a long time, just breathing, shaking. Eventually, we stumbled inside and bought 2 black coffees and a full tank of gas. Neither of us spoke about what we saw. Not then, not for years. When we finally did, it was over beers one cold night back home, when the memory had faded just enough to seem almost bearable. Marcus told me he'd heard stories growing up. Stories about things that lived out in the desert. Things that weren't quite dead, but weren't really alive either. Spirits twisted by the emptiness, feeding on fear and desperation. They said once you saw them, they never really let you go. I don't know if that's true, but sometimes when I'm driving alone at night through empty stretches of road, I catch a glimpse of something in the rearview mirror, a flash of pale skin, a glimpse of a too wide grin, and I drive a little faster. I'll never go back to the desert. And if you're smart, you...
Story number 2.
The desert had always felt like a second home to me. I spent my childhood summers in Arizona, visiting my grandfather, who lived in a small, isolated town about 30 miles from the nearest city. The heat was unbearable during the day, but the nights were something else entirely. Cool, endless, and filled with the kind of silence that made you hear things you normally wouldn't notice. It was during one of those visits when I was 21 that I experienced something I still can't explain. I had gone down for a week in early August. My grandfather had passed away earlier that year, and the house was sitting empty, untouched since the funeral. I went down partly to settle his affairs, partly because a part of me couldn't let the place go. The town itself was shrinking fast. Abandoned storefronts, empty streets, and only a handful of residents left. It was a place forgotten by time and slowly being reclaimed by the desert. I decided to stay in the old house for the week instead of getting a motel in the city. I thought it would be comforting, a way to feel close to him. But from the moment I arrived, it felt wrong. The house was fine, physically. No broken windows, no signs of vandalism, but there was a strange stillness inside, like the house itself was holding its breath. I blamed it on grief, on loneliness, and pushed the feeling aside. After spending a couple of days sorting through old paperwork and deciding what to keep, I started feeling restless. One evening, I decided to take a drive out into the desert. My grandfather used to take me off-roading when I was younger, showing me the places tourists never got to see. I still remembered some of the old dirt roads, how they twisted through the canyons and around the buttes like veins. I packed a cooler with some water and snacks, grabbed a flashlight, and set off about an hour before sunset. The drive was peaceful at first. The desert stretched out around me in every direction, golden and endless. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in deep oranges and purples. I kept driving, letting instinct guide me, following the vague memories of old adventures. By the time the sun had completely disappeared, I realized I was farther out than I intended. The road had narrowed to little more than 2 faint tire tracks in the dirt, and when I turned off the truck to listen, I realized just how far from anything I was. No lights, no sounds except the soft whisper of the wind. I told myself I'd turn around soon. I just wanted to get to the top of the next rise to see the stars. Out here, they looked closer than anywhere else on Earth, millions of them, brilliant and cold. I was halfway up a gentle slope when I saw something, or someone, standing by the side of the road. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a coyote, but as I got closer, the shape became clearer. It was a person. I slowed the truck, unsure what to do. They weren't moving, just standing there facing the road, head bowed slightly. I thought maybe they were hurt, maybe their car had broken down somewhere nearby. I stopped a few yards away and rolled down the window. "Hey, you okay?" I called out. No answer. They didn't even move. I leaned out a little further. "Do you need help?" Still nothing. Something in me screamed to just keep driving, but my better nature got the best of me. I put the truck in park, grabbed my flashlight, and got out. The night was quiet around me, eerily so. I clicked the flashlight on and shone it toward the figure. It was a man, maybe in his late 30s or early 40s, wearing clothes that looked decades out of place. An old, tattered jacket, jeans that were faded almost white. His face was hidden under the brim of a battered hat. I took a step closer. "Sir, do you need help?" As the beam of my flashlight hit him, he slowly raised his head. His face was gaunt, pale, with deep hollows under his eyes. His mouth hung slightly open, and his eyes, were blank, like glass marbles reflecting the light back at me. I stumbled backward, the hair on my arms standing on end. Every instinct screamed that something was terribly wrong. Without thinking, I turned and sprinted back to the truck, not daring to look back. I fumbled with the door handle, jumped in, and slammed the door shut, locking it. When I looked back through the windshield, he was gone. The road was empty. Just empty desert stretching out in every direction. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, trying to steady my breathing. My mind raced with explanations. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Maybe I was just tired. But deep down, I knew what I had seen. I turned the truck around and started heading back the way I came, not daring to go any deeper into the desert. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him standing there, but the road behind me stayed empty. After about 20 minutes of driving, the headlights caught something up ahead. I slowed down instinctively. It was another figure, standing dead center in the road. I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding slightly on the loose dirt. My heart was hammering in my chest. It wasn't the same man. This one was taller, thinner, wearing a long, tattered coat that fluttered slightly in the breeze. I didn't wait this time. I swerved around him and kept driving, speeding up as fast as I dared on the uneven road. As I passed him, I glanced out the window and caught a glimpse of his face, hollow, with deep, black sockets where his eyes should have been. The desert around me seemed to close in, the darkness becoming almost tangible, pressing against the truck. I could feel something chasing me, even though I didn't see anything when I dared to glance behind. I finally reached a more familiar road and followed it back to town without stopping. When I pulled into my grandfather's driveway, I sat in the truck for a long time, too shaken to move. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces, those hollow, staring faces, and the endless stretch of empty desert behind them. The next morning, I went into town to grab some coffee and clear my head. At the diner, I got to talking with one of the locals, an older man named Carl who had known my grandfather. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he joked, noticing my shaken demeanor. I hesitated, then told him what had happened, leaving out how terrified I had been. He listened quietly, his expression growing more serious with each detail. When I finished, he nodded slowly. "You're not the first," he said. "There's places out there, places you don't go after dark, places where the dead don't stay buried." I laughed nervously, thinking he was messing with me. "You're serious?" He just nodded again. Back in the 30s, during the Depression, a bunch of folks tried to settle out there, thought they could start over, live off the land, but it was brutal. No water, no food. Most of them died before they could even build proper homes. Some say their spirits are still out there, looking for help, for salvation they never found. He paused, leaning in closer. They get lost, trapped between worlds, and if you're not careful, if you stop for them, he shook his head, they might not let you leave. I left the diner shaken. It sounded crazy, like some ghost story to scare tourists, but it fit too well with what I had seen. I finished packing up the house that day and left the next morning, cutting my trip short. I never went back. Even now, years later, I still have nightmares sometimes. I dream I'm driving that dirt road again, and I see them standing there in the dark, waiting, always waiting. And every time I wake up with the same feeling, that part of me never really made it back from that night. Part of me is still out there, lost in the endless desert under the cold, unblinking stars. Story the end.
Story number 3.
We didn't believe them. Not really. It was just folklore, right? Tales spun by the locals to keep people from wandering too far into the desert's heart. That was what we thought, anyway. But when my friend Ryan suggested we go on a camping trip deep in the Arizona desert, I couldn't resist. It would be an adventure, we thought. A test of our courage. We had no idea what we were about to experience. Ryan, Mark, and I were all in our mid-20s, adrenaline junkies who thrived on pushing our limits. Hiking, climbing, and camping were our ways of bonding. We didn't fear much, and the idea of spending a night in the desert, without the comforts of modern life, seemed like the ultimate challenge. There was a particular spot that Ryan had heard about from a guy at work. It was an isolated area known only to locals, nestled deep in the desert, away from any real civilization. The kind of place that would be perfect for a night of camping, just the three of us. We packed our gear, loaded up the truck, and set off early in the morning. The drive was long, stretching across miles of barren land, and as we moved further into the desert, the landscape grew increasingly desolate. The sun beat down relentlessly, its rays turning the earth into a flat, shimmering expanse of heat. There were no trees or lakes, only the occasional cactus and the dry, cracked earth. The air felt thick with dust. The more we drove, the more the scenery started to warp. The desert wasn't just hot and dry. It felt like it was holding something back, as if the land was hiding something ancient and unknowable beneath its surface. The sun overhead felt like it was pressing down on us, a reminder of how small we were in the grand scheme of things. We joked to each other to keep the mood light, but there was a strange, subtle unease creeping in. Ryan, as the one who had discovered this place, was the most excited. "We'll be completely alone," he said, his voice almost reverent. "No other campers, just the open desert and us. It'll be perfect." When we finally arrived, the first thing that struck me was how quiet it was. Eerily quiet. The kind of silence that envelops you, making you feel as though the world itself has gone still, holding its breath. There were no birds, no wind rustling through trees, just an absolute stillness. It felt like we had stepped into a world untouched by time. The area Ryan had chosen was located near the remnants of an old ghost town, long abandoned. We could see the skeletons of what once had been buildings, broken down shacks with sagging roofs and crumbling walls. The ghost town wasn't on any official map, and it was clear that no one had lived there for decades. Still, there was something haunting about the place, something that made me uneasy. But we shrugged it off, eager to set up camp. We pitched our tents near the remains of an old, weathered building. It looked like it had once been a store or a post office, but now it was just a shell of its former self. The air around it felt heavy, thick with the weight of history. As we unpacked our gear, we noticed that the land around us seemed unnaturally quiet. Even the usual desert sounds, the rustling of dry grass, the occasional scurrying of small animals, were absent. The silence was oppressive, almost suffocating. As the sun began to set, we gathered around the campfire. The fire crackled and popped, casting flickering shadows on the ground. The flames danced in the evening breeze, and for a moment I forgot about the unease that had settled over me. We were just three friends in the desert, enjoying the solitude. But as night fell, something began to change. The temperature dropped suddenly, and the desert air, once scorching, now felt frigid. It was a sharp, biting cold that cut through our jackets, a chill that didn't seem natural for the desert. We huddled closer to the fire, our faces illuminated by the flickering flames. That's when we heard it, the first sound that would haunt us for the rest of the night. At first, it was a faint noise, barely audible but distinct enough to catch our attention. It sounded like whispering, soft voices carried on the wind. I glanced at Mark, who raised an eyebrow. "Do you hear that?" he asked. Ryan, ever the skeptic, dismissed it. "It's just the wind," he said, laughing it off. "Nothing to worry about." But it wasn't the wind. The whispers were too distinct, too deliberate. They came from somewhere close, somewhere just beyond the firelight. I stood up, straining my ears, trying to pinpoint where the voices were coming from. I could make out words, but they were just out of reach, like a conversation taking place in another room. I was about to suggest we investigate when a sudden, eerie chill washed over me, the kind of cold that sinks into your bones, making your skin prickle with unease. I turned back to the campfire, but Ryan and Mark had already stood up, their faces pale. "Did you see that?" Mark whispered, his voice shaking. Before I could respond, we all heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate steps crunching on the dry earth. At first, I thought it might be an animal, maybe a coyote or a rabbit, but the footsteps were too heavy, too measured. They came closer, moving in a pattern that didn't make sense. "Who's there?" Ryan called out, his voice tight with fear. There was no answer, just the sound of those slow, deliberate footsteps. They came closer, then stopped. For a long moment, everything was silent. Then, from the darkness beyond the firelight, a figure appeared. At first, I thought it was one of us, maybe Mark or Ryan playing a prank. But the figure wasn't moving like any of us. It was too stiff, too unnatural. And as it stepped into the dim light of the fire, I realized with horror that it wasn't a person at all. It was something else. The figure was tall and thin, draped in tattered clothes that looked like they had been there for decades. Its face was hidden by the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat, but I could see its hands, long, skeletal fingers that reached out toward us, twitching as if beckoning us forward. None of us could move. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. My heart pounded in my chest as the figure took a step forward, then another. The air felt thick with a suffocating presence, and the whispers we had heard earlier grew louder, like voices calling from beneath the earth. "Who are you?" Ryan finally managed to choke out, his voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, staring at us with an intensity that made my skin crawl. And then, with a sudden jerking motion, it began to move toward us faster than I thought possible. In an instant, we were running, scrambling for our tents, for the safety of the truck. The world around us blurred as we ran, the whispers still echoing in our ears, the figure's movements too fast, too unnatural. I could hear its footsteps behind us, growing louder, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there, nothing but the dark, empty desert. We didn't stop running until we reached the truck. We threw ourselves into the vehicle, slamming the doors shut behind us. For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was our ragged breathing, the weight of what we had just seen settling in. Ryan fumbled for the keys, his hands shaking, and finally started the engine. We drove out of there faster than I ever thought I would, not stopping until we reached the nearest town, where we found a motel and spent the night in terror, too scared to sleep. The next day, we made our way back home. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. We all knew what we had seen, and we all knew that whatever it wasn't human. We never spoke of it again, and none of us ever returned to that desert, not once. The desert had taken something from us that night, something we couldn't explain, and we didn't dare go back to try to understand it. Story, the end.
Story number 4.
I've spent my whole life around the desert. Growing up in Arizona, the barren stretches of land always felt familiar, almost comforting. People who didn't grow up here always said the desert was lonely, that it was dead. But they were wrong. The desert is alive in ways that are hard to explain. There's a pulse beneath the cracked earth, a rhythm that doesn't care if you notice it or not. It's old, ancient even, and it doesn't belong to us. 3 years ago, I took a job with a small land survey company. It was decent pay, and honestly, I liked the solitude. The work took me out into remote areas where most people never bothered to go. Places so far out that you could go hours without seeing another human being. That kind of silence has a way of getting under your skin if you're not used to it. I thought I was. I thought wrong. It was late August, right in the middle of one of the worst heat waves we'd had in a decade. I got assigned a stretch of desert near the old mining town of La Sombra. The place had been abandoned for over 100 years after the silver dried up, and all that remained were some collapsed buildings, rusted equipment, and rumors. People said La Sombra was cursed, that the miners disturbed something that wasn't meant to be disturbed. I never put much stock into stories like that, at least not back then. I left early in the morning, planning to finish my surveying before nightfall. The drive out there took longer than I expected. The dirt roads were little more than faded tracks, and twice I had to stop and clear debris to get my truck through. By the time I arrived at the old town site, the sun was high and brutal, beating down with a force that made the horizon shimmer and dance. I parked near what looked like the remains of an old general store and set out with my gear. The first few hours were uneventful. I took measurements, marked coordinates, and recorded notes. The silence was overwhelming. No birds, no insects, just the dry rasp of the wind and the occasional creak of the old wooden structures baking in the heat. It was like the place was holding its breath, waiting. Around mid-afternoon, the wind shifted. It came suddenly, hard enough to knock my hat off and send my papers scattering. As I chased them down, I noticed something strange, a line of footprints in the dust leading away from the town, out into the open desert. They weren't mine. They were older, half erased by the wind, but still clear enough to see. I don't know why, but looking at them made my skin crawl. I tried to shake it off. Maybe they belonged to another surveyor, or maybe some hiker had wandered through. Still, something about them didn't sit right. They were deep, spaced oddly, like whoever made them was dragging their feet or limping. Against my better judgment, I decided to follow them. The tracks led me further from the ruins, toward a low ridge about a mile away. As I climbed the rocky slope, I noticed how quiet it had gotten. Even the wind had died. It was like stepping into a vacuum. At the top of the ridge, I found it, a small cave, barely more than a crack in the stone. The footprints disappeared into the darkness. I should have turned around. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to leave, but curiosity got the better of me. I pulled out my flashlight and stepped inside. The air in the cave was cooler, but it smelled wrong, like metal and old earth and something else, something sour and rotten. The beam of my flashlight barely cut through the gloom. The walls were rough, natural, but there were marks on them. Scratches like someone, or something, had clawed at the stone. A few yards in, the passage opened into a small chamber. In the center of the floor was a hole, a perfectly round pit descending into darkness. I edged closer and shone my light down. I couldn't see the bottom. The walls of the pit were smooth, unnaturally so, like it had been carved by machines or hands. As I stood there trying to make sense of it, I heard it, a whisper, faint but unmistakable, rising up from the pit. It wasn't English, but it wasn't any language I recognized. It was a dry, rattling sound, like dead leaves skittering over stone. I stumbled back, heart hammering, and as I did, my light flickered and went out. Panic surged through me. I scrambled for the entrance, bumping into the walls, scraping my hands and knees on the rough stone. When I finally burst out into the sunlight, I didn't stop running. I didn't stop until I was back at my truck, gasping for air, drenched in sweat. I started the engine and tore out of there, not caring about the rocks and ruts that battered the undercarriage. I just needed to get away. but the desert doesn't let you go that easily. About 20 minutes into my drive back, I noticed something in the rearview mirror. Movement. At first, I thought it was a dust devil, but it was too dark, too solid. It was following me, keeping pace with the truck. I pressed harder on the gas, but no matter how fast I went, it stayed with me, always just at the edge of my vision. When I finally hit paved road, it was like crossing a barrier. The thing stopped following. I didn't see it again, but that didn't mean it was gone. That night, I checked into a cheap motel in the nearest town. I couldn't bear the thought of being alone in the desert. As I tried to fall asleep, I kept hearing that whispering sound, just at the edge of hearing. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the pit, the smooth walls descending into blackness. I didn't sleep. At some point around 3 a.m., I gave up and went to the bathroom to splash water on my face. When I looked up, I saw it behind me in the mirror, a tall, twisted figure, its skin like cracked earth, its mouth moving in a constant, soundless whisper. I spun around, but there was nothing there. I left the motel that minute, not even bothering to check out. I drove straight home, swearing to myself that I'd never go back to that part of the desert again. But it didn't matter. I brought something back with me. The whispers never stopped. They're quieter now, just a constant background noise I can't escape. Sometimes I see things out of the corner of my eye, shadows that move against the light, shapes that don't belong. And sometimes when I'm alone, I swear I can feel something watching me just out of reach. I don't know what I found out there. I don't want to know. But I can tell you this. The desert isn't empty. It's full of things older and hungrier than we can imagine. And once they notice you, they never forget. Story the end.
Story number 5.
The desert always held a strange sort of beauty for me. Wide open spaces, the endless stretch of sand, the way the sky turned deep purple and gold at sunset. There was a peace to it, something ancient and undisturbed. That was why I said yes without hesitation when my friend Eric suggested we spend a few days camping out there, just the two of us, a break from the constant buzz of city life. He had found a spot far from any known trails, a patch of desert he'd read about online where supposedly no one ventured anymore. We packed light, just the essentials, and drove out early one Saturday morning. The highway gave way to cracked, narrow roads, and then those roads disappeared completely, swallowed by the shifting sand. We drove as far as the Jeep would take us, and then hiked the rest of the way. It felt like walking into another world. The heat was oppressive, the sun unrelenting, and the land stretched in every direction with no end in sight. By the time we made camp, the sun was already dipping low, casting long shadows over the dunes. There was no sound but the wind, whispering across the sand like a voice too quiet to understand. Eric seemed at ease, humming to himself as he set up the tent, but I couldn't shake a growing feeling of unease. I chalked it up to the isolation. We were really out there, miles from anyone or anything. That night, after a quick meal cooked over a small fire, we sat watching the stars appear one by one. Without the city lights, the sky looked impossibly vast and crowded with stars. Eric eventually crawled into his sleeping bag, and I sat a little longer, staring up at the sky, feeling smaller than I ever had in my life. The desert cooled rapidly after sunset, and soon I could see my breath in the air. I was just about to turn in when I heard it. A faint sound carried on the wind. It was subtle, almost like a whistle or maybe a whisper. I froze, my ears straining. The desert was supposed to be silent at night, apart from the occasional call of a coyote or owl. But this wasn't an animal. It sounded like voices. I shook my head, trying to dismiss it. Maybe the wind played tricks out here. I doused the fire and climbed into the tent. Eric was already snoring softly. I closed my eyes, but sleep didn't come easily. Every time I started to drift off, I thought I heard the faint murmuring again, like a conversation just out of reach. I must have eventually fallen asleep because the next thing I knew, I woke up with a start. It was freezing, and the tent flapped violently in the wind. But that wasn't what woke me. It was something else, an overwhelming feeling that we weren't alone. I sat up, heart hammering. The desert outside was pitch black, but I could hear it now, clear as day. Footsteps in the sand, just outside the tent. Slow, deliberate, moving around us. I held my breath, listening. Eric stirred beside me, but didn't wake. The footsteps stopped right outside the entrance to the tent. I wanted to call out, ask who was there, but fear had closed my throat. Instead, I reached for the flashlight and flicked it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but when I pointed it at the tent's entrance, there was nothing. No shadow, no shape, just the fabric of the tent illuminated in the beam. I whispered Eric's name, shaking his shoulder. He groaned and rolled over, but didn't wake. I turned off the flashlight, figuring I was just letting my imagination get the better of me. The desert could mess with your senses, especially at night. I lay back down, pulling the sleeping bag tightly around me, but sleep was impossible. I stared at the roof of the tent, listening intently. The footsteps didn't return, but that didn't make me feel any better. When dawn finally broke, I got out of the tent, blinking against the early morning sun. The air was still, and the sand was cold beneath my boots. I half expected to see footprints around our camp, but there was nothing. The sand was smooth, untouched, except for our own tracks from the night before. I didn't mention anything to Eric. I didn't want to sound crazy, and he seemed in good spirits, oblivious to anything strange. We spent the day hiking the nearby ridges and marveling at the strange rock formations scattered across the landscape. It was almost enough to make me forget about the night before. Almost. As sunset approached, that familiar tension crept back in. We made another small fire and sat eating canned chili straight from the pot. Eric told stories about other trips he had taken, mountains, forests, even a stint in the Arctic, but I barely listened. My eyes kept drifting out to the darkening desert. As night fell, the temperature plummeted again and the wind picked up. The fire sputtered and struggled against the gusts. Eric laughed, tossing another log onto the flames, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Around midnight, after Eric had gone to bed, I sat alone by the dying fire. The stars were out again, but clouds were moving in, obscuring them bit by bit. I poked at the fire with a stick, lost in thought, when I caught something out of the corner of my eye. Movement. Just beyond the firelight. I froze, slowly turning my head. For a split second, I thought I saw a figure standing out there, motionless, staring at me. But when I blinked, it was gone. I stood up, heart racing. The fire popped and cracked behind me as I scanned the darkness, trying to make sense of what I had seen. I told myself it was a trick of the light, a shadow, but deep down I knew better. I doused the fire and retreated into the tent, zipping it up tightly behind me. Eric was asleep again, his face peaceful in the dim light of the flashlight hanging from the ceiling. I lay there, every muscle tense, listening. The whispering started again, faint and disjointed, like snippets of conversation carried on the wind. But this time, it was closer, much closer. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing it to stop, but it didn't. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, surrounding the tent. I could make out words now, though they didn't make sense, fragments of sentences, names I didn't recognize. And then the voices began to rise, overlapping, growing frantic, angry. I opened my eyes, and to my horror, the walls of the tent began to bulge inward, as if unseen hands were pressing against them from the outside. I scrambled backward, clutching my sleeping bag, my heart pounding so loud I could barely hear the chaos outside. Eric woke with a start, looking around in confusion. What the hell? Before he could finish, the tent collapsed. It just caved in on us, poles snapping, fabric crumpling. I fought my way out, gasping for air, and stumbled into the open desert. The night was black, the stars gone, the wind howling. Eric scrambled out behind me, cursing. We stood there, disoriented, trying to figure out what had just happened. And then we saw them. Figures in the darkness. Dozens of them. Pale, indistinct, like smudges of smoke against the night. They stood at the edges of our destroyed campsite, watching. Eric grabbed my arm. We need to go. Now. We didn't bother with our gear. We just ran. The sand made every step a struggle, and the cold air burned our lungs, but we didn't stop. The figures didn't chase us, but we could feel them behind us, following, their presence heavy in the air. We didn't stop running until we reached the Jeep. Somehow, miraculously, we found our way back, though neither of us remembered the path we had taken. We jumped in, and Eric fumbled with the keys, finally getting the engine to roar to life. As we sped away, I looked in the rearview mirror. The figures still stood there, watching. We drove through the night, not speaking, not daring to look back. When we finally reached the main road, the sun was rising, casting a bloody glow over the horizon. We didn't stop until we were miles away, back in civilization, where the desert couldn't reach us. We never spoke of that night again. Eric and I drifted apart after that, like whatever we had witnessed had driven a wedge between us. I moved back to the city, trying to forget, trying to pretend it had all been a nightmare. But sometimes when the wind howls through the buildings late at night, I hear it again, the whispering, the voices carried on the wind, and I wonder if the desert ever really let us go. Story the end.
Story number 6.
Growing up in southern Nevada, the desert was just part of life. You got used to the heat, the isolation, the endless horizon that made you feel both free and trapped at the same time. My dad used to say the desert wasn't just land. It was alive, and it remembered things people would rather forget. I always thought he was just being dramatic, a storyteller. Now I know better. It was the summer after I graduated high school. I didn't have big plans like most of my friends. College didn't interest me, and my job bussing tables at a local diner felt like a dead end, even though I'd barely started. I was restless, looking for something, though I couldn't have said what. So when my cousin Trevor suggested a camping trip out near Black Hollow, a dry basin about 40 miles from town, I said yes without thinking twice. Black Hollow wasn't a popular spot. In fact, most locals avoided it. There were stories, sure, strange lights, sounds, people going missing, but they sounded more like bar gossip than real warnings. Trevor and I packed up a beat-up truck with camping gear, a cooler full of beer, and some sleeping bags. We figured we'd spend the weekend drinking, joking around, and getting away from our boring lives. The drive out there was uneventful. The highway melted into gravel roads, and then those disappeared too, replaced by tire tracks in the dust. We didn't see another car for miles. The landscape was all dry, cracked earth, and low scrub brush, the kind of place where you could scream and no one would ever hear you. When we finally got to the spot, the sun was starting to set, turning the sky a brilliant blood red. It was beautiful in that lonely way only the desert can be. We set up camp near the base of a rocky outcrop. There were strange markings on the stones, petroglyphs, maybe, but neither of us paid much attention. We built a fire, cracked open a few beers, and settled in for the night. It felt good at first. The fire crackled, coyotes howled in the distance, and the stars looked close enough to touch. Around midnight, the wind picked up. It came out of nowhere, a sharp, sudden gust that made the flames dance violently. Trevor cursed and grabbed the tarp we'd set up, trying to pin it down. That's when I heard it. A low, humming sound, so deep I felt in my chest more than heard it. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't any animal I'd ever known. "Do you hear that?" I asked, my voice almost lost in the rising wind. Trevor nodded, his face pale in the firelight. "Yeah," he said. "Sounds like singing." That wasn't the word I would have used. It wasn't human, whatever it was. It was too steady, too hollow, like the sound of 1,000 voices whispering from underground. The fire sputtered, struggling against the wind. Shadows moved in the darkness beyond the circle of light. I told myself it was just the brush, the desert playing tricks on us, but deep down I didn't believe it. Then we saw them, figures standing just beyond the reach of the firelight, tall, impossibly thin, with limbs too long and heads that seemed slightly wrong. They didn't move. They just stood there, staring, if they even had eyes to stare with. My skin broke out in goosebumps despite the heat. Every instinct I had screamed at me to run. Trevor grabbed my arm. "Get in the truck," he hissed. We bolted, leaving the gear behind. The truck's headlights barely pierced the darkness, but I could see them, dozens of them now, gathered around the camp, unmoving. Trevor turned the key. Nothing. He tried again, and again. The engine just clicked uselessly. Come on," he shouted, pounding the steering wheel. The humming grew louder, vibrating through the metal of the truck. I pressed my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. It wasn't just a sound, it was inside me, like it was trying to tear something loose. Then the lights went out. Not just the headlights, but everything. The stars, the moon, even the fire. Total, smothering blackness. For a few heartbeats, there was nothing. No sound, no light, just the sensation of pressure all around us. And then slowly a pale, sickly light bloomed outside the truck. It wasn't natural. It cast everything in a greenish tint, making the desert look warped and wrong. Through the windshield, I saw something standing right in front of us. It wasn't like the others. It was bigger, hunched, its skin cracked and flaking like dried mud. Its face, I can barely describe it. It looked human at first glance, but the longer you looked, the less it made sense. Eyes too far apart, a mouth that stretched too wide. It lifted one long, clawed hand and tapped the hood of the truck. Once, twice, 3 times. And then I wasn't in the truck anymore. I was standing in the desert, barefoot, the ground cold and wet beneath my feet. Wet. That didn't make sense. Black Hollow was bone dry. I looked down and saw that the earth was slick with something dark and sticky. I couldn't tell what it was, and I didn't want to. The figures circled me now closer than before. Their bodies twitched and jerked in unnatural ways like puppets on broken strings. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. They pressed in, their whispering voices rising to a deafening roar inside my skull. And then, just as suddenly, I was back in the truck. Trevor was shaking me, shouting my name. The engine roared to life, the headlights blazing. Without a word, he threw it into reverse and peeled out, kicking up clouds of dust. We didn't stop driving until we hit the main highway. Even then, we didn't speak for a long time. Finally, Trevor muttered, "We're never going back there." I nodded, still shaking. I didn't need to be told twice. The next morning, we drove back to town in silence. When we stopped at a gas station on the outskirts, an old man sitting outside watched us with narrowed eyes. As we pumped gas, he shuffled over. "You boys come from Black Hollow?" he asked. We didn't answer. Didn't need to. He nodded like he understood anyway. "Some places out here," he said, "they ain't meant for folks like us. Desert keeps its secrets. You're lucky it let you leave." I wanted to laugh, to tell him how crazy that sounded, but all I could do was nod. Weeks went by. Trevor and I barely talked after that. He started drinking more, lost his job, got into fights. Then, one night, he disappeared. His truck was found abandoned on the side of the highway, doors wide open, no sign of a struggle, no sign of him at all. I didn't tell anyone what happened at Black Hollow. Would you have believed me? Now, sometimes late at night, I hear that low humming again, just beneath the noise of the world. Sometimes I see shapes in the corner of my eye, standing still and silent, waiting. The desert doesn't forget. And some nights, I wonder if it's only a matter of time before it comes back for me too. Story. The end.
Story number 7.
I never expected the desert to feel so heavy. You always think of it as empty, wide open skies, endless stretches of sand, a place where nothing clings to you. But that's not the kind of desert I found myself in 4 years ago, when my buddy Kyle talked me into helping him with a photography project for his college portfolio. We both grew up in Flagstaff, so deserts weren't anything new to us. Kyle had this idea to capture the isolation and decay of some abandoned mining towns scattered along the Arizona-Nevada border. I agreed because, honestly, I didn't have anything better to do that summer. Plus, the thought of getting out into the middle of nowhere had a certain appeal. We packed up his old Jeep with supplies, cameras, tripods, enough food and water for a week, and set out. Kyle had done his research and picked a site he said was perfect, an old silver mining camp that had been deserted since the 1940s. No real roads led there anymore. We'd have to hike the last mile or so after the Jeep gave out. But Kyle was convinced it would be worth it. The drive took most of the day, winding deeper into territory where the cell service dropped out completely, and the paved roads turned to gravel, then dirt. It was late afternoon when we parked the Jeep under the skeletal shade of a few dying Joshua trees. From there, we loaded up our backpacks and started walking. The landscape around us was harsh and alien. Boulders the size of trucks littered the land, and occasional patches of dead scrub rustled in the dry wind. The heat beat down on us mercilessly, even as the sun began to lower. As we crested a ridge, we finally caught sight of it, the ghost town. It wasn't much to look at from a distance. A handful of collapsed wooden structures, rusted-out mining equipment, half buried in the sand, and what looked like the ruins of a small church, its steeple barely clinging to the roofline. When we got closer, the feeling changed. I could tell Kyle felt it too. He stopped beside me, staring at the crumbling buildings with a strange expression on his face. The air had gone completely still, as if the whole place was holding its breath. We set up camp about 100 yards away from the town. Neither of us wanted to sleep inside the ruins. As the sun disappeared behind the jagged horizon, the desert cooled rapidly. We built a small fire, cooked some instant noodles, and tried to shake off the weird mood that had settled over us. Kyle was eager to start shooting, even though the light was terrible. He grabbed his camera and headed off toward the town while I stayed back, feeding the fire and staring up at the stars. After about 30 minutes, he came back, his face pale and tight. "There's something wrong with this place," he said, sitting heavily on the ground. I laughed it off, but he didn't. He kept glancing over his shoulder toward the town. I asked him what happened, but he just shook his head and said he'd explain in the morning. That night, the wind picked up. I woke around 2 a.m. to the sound of the tent flapping violently. When I crawled out to check the stakes, I saw lights, tiny, flickering lights, moving among the ruins. At first, I thought they were reflections from our dying fire, but the fire was almost out. The lights floated between the structures, dipping and weaving like someone carrying lanterns through the town. I woke Kyle up. He came stumbling out of the tent, bleary-eyed, until he saw them too. We didn't speak. We just stood there watching the lights dance. After a while, we realized they weren't moving naturally. They weren't flickering like firelight. They were steady, mechanical, almost purposeful. "I'm getting the hell out of here," Kyle whispered. We packed up our gear haphazardly, shoving sleeping bags into backpacks and grabbing what we could. As we scrambled to collect our things, I heard it, the faint sound of singing. Children's voices, high and sweet, drifting across the desert. I froze. Kyle did too. The singing got louder, and with it came the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching over gravel. But when we shined our flashlights toward the town, there was nothing there. No people, just the lights, still bobbing and weaving. We didn't wait any longer. We grabbed our stuff and started running toward the ridge where we had left the Jeep. It felt like we ran for miles, even though it couldn't have been more than half a mile. When we reached the Jeep, I fumbled with the keys, dropping them twice before finally managing to get the door open. We piled in, locked the doors, and I floored it, tires spitting gravel behind us. As we drove away, Kyle looked back and swore he saw figures standing at the top of the ridge, watching us. We didn't talk much on the drive back. I dropped him off at his apartment around dawn and headed home, exhausted and wired all at once. I told myself we'd just spooked ourselves. Long day, weird place, a little hysteria. It could happen to anyone. But 2 days later, Kyle called me. He sounded shaken, panicked. "You have to come over," he said. "I can't explain it. You just have to see." When I got to his place, he was sitting on the floor surrounded by his camera gear. The photos he had taken at the town were spread out around him. Every photo was wrong. The town was there, but it looked different. In the pictures, the buildings weren't collapsed or abandoned. They looked new, bustling with people dressed in clothes straight out of the early 20th century. And the people in the photos, they were wrong too. Their faces were blurred, distorted, twisted into grotesque, unnatural expressions. In one photo, a man stood in front of the church, his mouth stretched wide in a silent scream, his eyes black hollows. In another, a little girl stood by a broken fountain, her head tilted at an impossible angle. Kyle flipped through them frantically, his hands shaking. "I didn't see any of this when I was there," he said. "I swear to God, I was just taking shots of empty buildings." I didn't know what to say. I still don't. We agreed to burn the photos. We took them out to the edge of town that night, lit them on fire, and watched them curl and blacken in the flames. After that, things got worse for Kyle. He said he could hear the singing sometimes when he was alone, always at night. He moved back in with his parents a few months later, trying to get a fresh start. Last I heard, he moved out of state and doesn't talk about that summer at all. As for me, I stayed. But I don't go out into the desert anymore, not at night. Sometimes, when the wind is just right, I swear I can hear it, the faint sound of children's voices singing from far off across the sand. And when I do, I turn around, go inside, and lock every door and window, because I know that not everything out there in the desert stays dead. Dead. Story.
Story number 8.
I had been photographing abandoned towns for years, ever since I finished college. Ghost towns were my passion, and I thought I'd seen it all. Collapsing saloons, sun-bleached churches, hollowed-out homes where only the wind lived. But nothing prepared me for the desert stretch between Arizona and Nevada, the place where even locals hesitated to tread. They called it Deadwater, A vast, empty space with no proper roads, no gas stations, and almost no sign of human touch for miles. A friend of mine, Curtis, had mentioned an abandoned mining town out there, not listed on any maps. Supposedly, it had been erased after a tragedy nobody liked to talk about. That was enough to hook me. I loaded up my old 4Runner with camera gear, extra fuel, water, and a week's worth of supplies. I told myself I was ready for anything. I wasn't. The first day was simple enough. Endless stretches of 2-lane blacktop cutting through fields of brown and red dust. Occasionally, a cactus loomed on the horizon like a sentry. As I got deeper into Deadwater, my GPS became less reliable and cell service dropped off entirely. I navigated by printed directions Curtis had scrawled on a napkin. Turn at the broken windmill, follow the dry riverbed until you see a dead tree shaped like a man. It sounded ridiculous at the time, but that's exactly how it was out there. I found the windmill, rusted and tilting. The riverbed was nothing but cracked mud. The dead tree was unmistakable, a gnarled thing standing alone, looking like it might stagger toward you if the wind blew right. The town appeared around a bend, almost hidden behind a series of rocky outcroppings. It didn't even look real at first. A handful of buildings, roofs caved in, the skeletal remains of a main street with weathered wood signs swinging in the dry breeze. I parked the 4Runner and grabbed my camera, stepping cautiously into the town. It was dead silent. Not the normal kind of silence you find in abandoned places, but a deeper, heavier one. No insects, no birds, not even the whisper of wind once I crossed into the town's perimeter. The air felt thick, almost damp, despite the oppressive heat. I spent the day shooting photos. The saloon was the best preserved, still holding on to some broken bar stools and a cracked mirror behind the bar. I found an old ledger, its pages fused together with time. Most of the names were illegible, but one line stuck out, "May God forgive us all." I moved on to the general store, then what must have been a boarding house. Upstairs, in one of the rooms, I found a child's doll sitting upright on a bed frame stripped of its mattress. It looked newer than everything else around it, untouched by sun and sand. That unsettled me more than anything else. I decided to camp just outside the town. The sun was dropping fast, staining the sky with bruised purples and reds. I didn't want to drive back in the dark with no landmarks and no lights. Setting up camp about 50 yards from the nearest building, I made a small fire using some dry brush I collected. As night swallowed the desert, the temperature plummeted and the strange silence deepened. I cooked a can of beans over the fire and tried to shake the unease that gnawed at me. Around midnight, I started hearing things. At first, it was just the crunch of gravel, soft and slow, like someone walking in circles around my camp. I thought maybe it was a coyote, but no animal would move like that. Methodical, pacing. Then the whispering started. Low, fragmented voices just at the edge of hearing, too faint to make out words, but unmistakably human. I sat rigid by the fire, flashlight in one hand, a rusted hunting knife in the other. The whispering grew louder, closer. I flicked my flashlight toward the town. Nothing, just empty doorways and the skeletons of buildings. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw them. Figures, standing in the street, dozens of them. Motionless, as if they'd simply materialized from the dust. Men, women, even children. Faces obscured, bodies wrapped in the kind of old-fashioned clothes you'd expect in a town that died 100 years ago. I blinked hard. They were gone. I told myself it was exhaustion, maybe dehydration. I doused the fire and crawled into my tent, zipping it shut tight. Sleep didn't come easy. Every few minutes I thought I heard someone, or something, brushing against the fabric of the tent, a finger tracing the seams, breathing close enough that I could almost feel it. Somewhere near dawn, I finally slipped into a shallow, miserable sleep. When I woke, the tent was unzipped, wide open to the desert. I know I hadn't left it like that. My boots were missing, and when I stepped outside barefoot, I saw a single line of footprints circling the campfire, over and over. Not mine. They were too small. Panicking, I packed up in record time. I decided to go back into the town for one last photo before I left, just to prove to myself that I wasn't losing it. I marched into the saloon and raised my camera. The mirror behind the bar was intact now, clean and gleaming, and reflected in it was a packed room. People stood shoulder to shoulder, frozen, their hollow eyes locked on me, their mouths hung open, black and empty. I turned around. The saloon was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, the crowd was closer. I ran. I didn't care that I left gear behind. I just needed to get back to the Forerunner and put as much distance between me and that town as possible. The drive out was worse than the drive in. The landscape looked different, like it shifted when I wasn't looking. Landmarks were wrong, missing. The dead tree was gone. The dry riverbed looked unfamiliar. I was losing it. I knew I was. The compass on my dash spun uselessly. Hours passed. The sun baked the world into a white haze, and my throat felt like sandpaper. Just when I was about to give up and backtrack to the town, I saw the windmill, or what was left of it. Now it was a crumpled wreckage, as if something had smashed it into the ground. I drove faster, tires kicking up clouds of dust. Finally, the highway appeared like a shimmering mirage, and I swerved onto it without slowing down. I didn't breathe easy until I hit the outskirts of a small town an hour later, where cell service blinked back to life. Curtis was the first person I called. I needed answers. He answered on the second ring. "You made it out?" he asked, his voice tight. "What the hell was that place?" I demanded. There was a long silence. "They don't talk about it because you're not supposed to go there," he said finally. "Something bad happened a long time ago. They tried to mine too deep, found something they shouldn't have. It poisoned the town, not with gas or disease, with something worse." I didn't believe him. I couldn't. It sounded insane. But when I went back through the photos I'd taken later that night, trying to convince myself it had all been a bad dream, I found something that shattered any doubt. In every shot of the town, tucked into corners, peeking from windows, standing in doorways, were the same blurred, half-formed figures I had seen that night. And in one frame, the final shot of the saloon, the crowd wasn't just staring from the mirror. They were looking straight at me, faces pressed against the glass, mouths wide in silent screams. Story the end.
Story number 9.
The desert was a place that had always fascinated me, though I had never truly respected it until the year I decided to join my cousin Derek on one of his archaeological surveys in southern Arizona. He worked for a small university that often sent teams into remote, undocumented areas looking for signs of ancient settlements, old trails, petroglyphs, anything that could be recorded and preserved before time or careless travelers destroyed it. Derek was a few years older than me, serious but easy to get along with, and had been doing this kind of work for a long time. When he asked if I wanted to tag along on one of his week-long trips, I jumped at the chance, thinking it would be an adventure. I didn't realize until it was too late that the desert is a living, breathing thing, and some parts of it have been dead longer than memory can hold. Places people are simply not meant to go. We set out in early September when the brutal summer heat had just begun to dip. Derek had picked a spot well off the beaten path, a long-forgotten area a few hours from the nearest paved road, nestled in a wide basin surrounded by jagged, skeletal mountains. We had 2 4x4s packed with supplies, satellite phones, and even a backup generator. But the moment we left the last sign of civilization behind, I felt a prickle run down my spine. The landscape was empty in a way that was oppressive. Not peaceful like I'd imagined, as if it had been abandoned long ago for reasons no one talked about. We arrived at the site by late afternoon. It was just a barren patch of desert littered with odd rocks and low shrubs, with the cracked remains of what might have been a stone foundation or wall half buried by sand. Derek set up camp a few hundred yards away from the ruins, muttering about preservation and respecting the site. We pitched 2 tents, set up a cooking area, and unpacked the equipment he'd need to catalog anything we found. As the sun sank low and painted the world in orange and blood-red hues, the desert changed. The comforting warmth fled, replaced by a creeping chill that felt unnatural, as if something were pulling the heat right out of the earth. The wind whispered over the sand, carrying a high, almost inaudible wail that sounded like someone crying far, far away. I shrugged it off as wind tricking my ears. After all, deserts were notorious for playing with your senses. But as I stood outside my tent brushing my teeth, I caught something in the corner of my eye, movement near the ruins. I turned sharply but saw nothing, just the rocks and the dying light. That night, I slept fitfully. The cold was biting even through my thick sleeping bag, and every time I started to drift off, a noise outside would jerk me awake. a low rustling, faint footsteps on the sand, the soft moan of the wind through rocks. Once or twice, I thought I heard someone whispering right outside my tent, but every time I sat up and listened, there was only silence. Morning was no better. The desert seemed even more lifeless in the harsh light of day. Derek looked exhausted, but didn't mention anything about the night. We spent most of the morning photographing the ruins, measuring, sketching, documenting. I tried to stay focused, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The sense of being an intruder grew with each hour. Around noon, Derek uncovered something unusual, a small stone circle, half buried. As he brushed away the sand, I noticed strange markings etched into the stones, symbols I didn't recognize. They were crude but deliberate, worn smooth by time. Derek frowned as he examined them. "This doesn't fit the style of anything from the region," he muttered. "Looks older." Something about the symbols made my skin crawl. They weren't just decorative. They felt purposeful, protective, maybe, like a warning. That evening, after logging the day's findings, Derek sat hunched over his laptop, trying to match the symbols with known records. I wandered back toward the stone circle, curiosity getting the better of me. The air grew inexplicably colder as I approached, and the low sun cast long, dark shadows across the ground. I stood there staring at the stones, feeling an overwhelming sadness settle over me like a thick blanket. My chest tightened. It wasn't fear, not exactly, more like a deep, aching grief. I turned to go back to camp, but as I did, I caught another flicker of movement among the ruins. This time I saw it clearly, a figure standing just beyond the low wall. It was a woman, or the shape of a woman, draped in tattered cloth that fluttered in the wind. Her face was obscured by a hood or veil, and she stood utterly still, watching me. I opened my mouth to call out to her, but no sound came. My limbs refused to move. I could only stare, heart hammering, as the figure slowly lifted a hand and pointed directly at me. Then, as if the desert itself swallowed her, she vanished. I stumbled back to camp, shaken. I didn't tell Derek. I knew how it would sound. Maybe it was a trick of the light, I told myself. An optical illusion. But that night, the whispering returned, louder and more insistent. It seemed to come from all around us, rising and falling in a mournful chant that I couldn't understand. Around midnight, I heard Derek unzip his tent and step outside. I peeked out to see him standing stiffly, staring out toward the ruins. "Derek?" I called softly. He didn't respond. I climbed out of my tent, the sand cold under my bare feet. I approached him slowly, noticing that he was trembling. His eyes were wide, fixed on something I couldn't see. "I have to go," he whispered. "They're calling me." Before I could react, he started walking toward the ruins, fast, then faster, breaking into a lurching run. I chased after him, yelling his name, but the desert seemed to swallow my voice. He reached the stone circle and stopped, standing inside it. The wind howled around us, whipping up the sand so hard it stung my skin, and then the ground beneath him caved in. I screamed and rushed forward, falling to my knees at the edge of the circle. Derek was gone, swallowed by a gaping hole that stretched down into blackness. I could hear nothing but the roar of the wind and a low, guttural chanting rising from deep below. I called for him until my throat was raw, but there was no answer, only that terrible sound from the earth. I don't remember how I made it back to camp. I must have stumbled blindly, driven by pure instinct. I grabbed the satellite phone with shaking hands and tried to call for help, but the line was dead. Nothing but static. I spent the rest of the night sitting by the fire, clutching the phone, shivering uncontrollably. I didn't dare go back to the ruins. At first light, I packed what little I could into one of the trucks and drove out of there like a madman. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, nearly 100 miles away. I reported what happened. Search teams were sent. They found the ruins, the collapsed ground, but no sign of Derek. Not a body, not a trace. They said it was probably an old mine shaft he'd fallen into, unstable and hidden until he disturbed it. That's the official story. But I know the truth. I still dream about that night, about the figure in the ruins, the chanting, the unbearable grief that pressed down on my soul. Sometimes in the early hours of morning, I wake to find sand scattered across my bedroom floor and a faint whisper lingering in the air, calling me back. Story the end.
Story number 10.
I grew up in a small town tucked right against the edge of the Arizona desert. where the roads faded into cracked earth and the wind carried more sand than air. People in my town knew better than to wander too far off the trails, especially at night. There were stories, everyone knew them, about things that moved out there when the sun went down, things that weren't supposed to be disturbed. Most folks said it was just old legends, warnings passed down to keep kids from getting lost or hurt. I believed that too until the summer of 2014. I was 24 then, working construction during the day and helping my uncle with his junkyard at night. It wasn't exciting work, but it paid the bills. My best friend Kyle had a thirst for adventure that didn't match the small-town life we were stuck in. He was always looking for ways to shake things up, to do something that felt bigger than ourselves. That's how he came up with the idea to explore the abandoned town site of Bitter Wash. Bitter Wash had been a mining camp back in the late 1800s, but a cave-in killed most of the workers and the place was deserted almost overnight. Some said the land had been cursed even before the mine opened, that the miners ignored warnings from the local tribes about disturbing what was buried there. The town had been left to rot for over a century, and most people didn't even talk about it anymore. Kyle convinced me, along with our friends Mike and Jesse, to camp out there one weekend. I wasn't thrilled about it, but I figured it would be a good story to tell later. We packed up our trucks with gear, tents, food, flashlights, a few cases of beer, and set out on a Friday afternoon. The drive took hours, winding through nameless dirt roads until the landscape around us felt completely alien. The desert out there was different, harsher, emptier, like something was missing from it. Even the air tasted different, heavy and stale. We got to the town site just as the sun was setting. What's left of Bitter Wash was barely recognizable, a few leaning structures eaten away by sand and time, rusted out equipment half buried in the dunes, a skeletal church still clinging to the center of it all. It didn't take much to imagine how the place must have looked back when it was alive, buzzing with miners, horses, wagons. Now it felt like it had been forgotten by everything except the wind. We set up camp near what had once been the main street, close to the church. As night fell, the temperature dropped sharply. The desert doesn't hold on to heat once the sun goes. We built a fire and sat around drinking, laughing, trying to shake off the creeping unease that none of us would admit we felt. The night sky was so clear it didn't seem real, stars stretching from one horizon to the other like a giant cracked mirror. Around midnight, the wind picked up. It wasn't just a breeze. It was a steady, bone-deep howling that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The fire flickered violently. That's when Jesse pointed toward the church. At first, I didn't see anything, just the dark shape of the building swaying slightly in the wind. But then I caught movement, a shadow slipping through the broken doorway. Quick, smooth, almost like it was gliding. Mike laughed it off, said it was probably just the wind playing tricks on us. But none of us laughed with him. We decided to go check it out, mostly because none of us wanted to be the one who said no. Kyle led the way with his flashlight, and the rest of us followed, sticking close together. The church smelled like dust and rot, the wood underfoot brittle and soft. The pews were overturned, the altar collapsed. It looked like the place had been abandoned in a hurry. In the beam of Kyle's flashlight, something glinted at the back of the church. A trapdoor, half hidden under debris. Without thinking, Kyle cleared it off and pried it open. A set of stone steps led down into the darkness. "Nope," Jesse said immediately, backing away. But Kyle was already climbing down. Mike hesitated a second, then followed him. I stood there, frozen, every hair on my body standing on end. Something about that trapdoor felt wrong, ancient wrong, like it shouldn't even exist. "You coming or what?" Kyle called up. I didn't want to be alone, so I went. The air below was even heavier, thick with the smell of wet earth and something else, something sharp, metallic, like blood. The steps ended in a narrow corridor carved straight into the rock. The walls were covered in scratches, deep grooves like someone or something had clawed at the stone. "Looks like a mine shaft," Mike whispered, his voice trembling. We moved slowly, the only sound our footsteps and the distant moaning of the wind above us. After maybe 50 yards, the passage opened into a larger chamber. The ceiling arched high above us, and the floor was littered with bones. Not animal bones. Human. Skulls stared up at us from the dirt, their mouths frozen in silent screams. Old tools lay scattered among them, pickaxes, shovels, lanterns long since extinguished. It was like a mass grave had been left here, forgotten under the desert. We didn't have time to react before we heard it, a low, guttural whispering rising up from the dark corners of the chamber. We spun around, shining our flashlights in every direction, but there was nothing there. The whispers grew louder, overlapping until they formed words we couldn't understand. Then the lights went out. It was instant, total blackness. I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. Panic surged through me. I reached out blindly, trying to grab onto Kyle or Mike or anyone. I felt a hand brush against mine. Cold, dry, wrong. Not human. I yanked my hand back and stumbled toward where I thought the stairs were. I slammed into someone, Jesse, and together we clawed our way down the corridor. I heard Kyle shouting behind us, something about not leaving him. Then his voice cut off mid-sentence. Jesse and I didn't stop. We found the stairs and scrambled up them, bursting out into the night air. The fire was out. The trucks were gone. No tire tracks. No sign anyone had ever been there. The desert stretched out empty and silent around us, darker than it had any right to be. We called for Mike and Kyle until our voices gave out. Nothing answered but the wind. Jesse wanted to start walking back to town, but something told me we wouldn't make it if we stayed on foot. We decided to follow the dirt road back the way we came, hoping someone would find us. Hours passed. The stars faded, replaced by an angry gray dawn. We never found the trucks. We never found Kyle or Mike. When we finally stumbled into a gas station just outside town, the attendant looked at us like we were ghosts. We must have looked like hell, scratched, dirty, wild-eyed. We tried to tell the police what happened, but no one believed us. They organized a search party, but all they found at Bitterwash were the same ruins, undisturbed. No trapdoor, no bones, no sign of Kyle or Mike. The place looked like no one had been there in decades. Jesse left town a month later, moved up north, got as far from the desert as he could. I stayed. I don't know why. Maybe part of me hoped Kyle and Mike would come back. They didn't. Sometimes late at night, I hear knocking at my door, 3 sharp knocks, just like the clawed hand tapping at the church floor. I never open it. I know better now. I know the desert never forgets. Story the end.